Liverpool, the largest port city in the northwest of England, was a mixture of ancient charm and modern life in the early 1990s. The streets of the city were full of family homes, bustling markets, and bustling shopping malls where locals went shopping or just to spend time. Despite the economic difficulties, many areas of Liverpool maintained an atmosphere of closeness and good neighborliness. Families could safely let their children play in the yards, and a walk to the nearest store often became a meeting place for friends and acquaintances. The Bulger family lived in one of these areas. A young couple, Denise and Ralph Burger, raised their 2-year-old son James in love and care. James was the first child in the family, and his appearance was the beginning of a new, happy stage of life for his parents. Denise adored her son and proudly told friends that he was always cheerful and full of energy. "He was my little sunshine," she said. James was a boy who immediately attracted attention. His bright blue eyes and wide smile instantly endeared him to people. He loved exploring the world around him and always asked a lot of questions. Even at the age of 2, he was a surprisingly sociable child. His hobbies included toy cars, which he happily rolled on the floor, and colorful picture books that he could look at for hours.
On the 12th of February 1993, the toddler was abducted from the New
Friday, February 12th, 1993 was no different from other winter days in Liverpool. In the morning, Denise decided to go with James to the New Strand shopping center, located in the Bootle area. This center was one of the most popular places among the residents of the city. For the Bulger family, it was a familiar place to shop. Here you could find everything you needed, from groceries to children's clothes. Denise planned to buy groceries for the week and look for new clothes for James, who was already growing fast. Like any caring mother, she tried to do everything possible for her son so that he did not need anything. Her husband, Ralph, was at work, so Denise took James with her, as she often did. The boy liked such trips. He loved the bright shop windows, the sounds of the mall, and the opportunity to sometimes get a new toy or a sweet as a gift. Denise and James arrived at the New Strand around noon. The mall was packed with people, as it usually is on a Friday. Denise, holding her son's hand, began to go around the shops, looking at the windows and shopping. James, as always, was animated and tried to look at everything around him. James played a lot of pranks in the children's clothing store where they were with their mother. To calm the situation down a little, Denise left her son outside the door of the next shop, not planning to stay long. However, due to an error with her order from the butcher, it took a little longer than she expected. When Denise left the store, her son was nowhere to be seen. Denise considered the mall a safe place where nothing could happen to her child. However, this turned out not to be the case. Her heart skipped a beat. At first, she thought he had just gone to another storefront and started looking for him nearby, calling his name. When her search failed, Denise felt a growing panic. She looked around the store, looked behind the windows, asked other customers if they had seen a little boy, but none of those present could tell where he might have gone. Denise ran out of the store and started looking for James in other departments of the mall. Being in a state of stress, Denise turned to the staff of the center. The guards promptly joined the search. A missing child announcement was made via the internal notification system, and all visitors were asked to pay attention to a 2-year-old boy. Employees began checking the recordings from the surveillance cameras installed on the territory of the center. Denise continued to rush up and down the floors, calling her son louder and louder. Panic gripped her, and tears blurred her eyes. She understood that her James never went far and always stayed by her side. It seemed impossible that he had disappeared in a matter of seconds. After about 20 minutes of unsuccessful searches, Denise contacted the police. The officers arrived at the scene promptly, realizing that the bill could go on for minutes. They began interviewing eyewitnesses, reviewing camera footage, and looking for possible leads. The police tried to support the mother, who was in a state of shock. The New Strand Mall has now become a potential crime scene. The police began to study the recordings from the surveillance cameras installed in the shopping center. They hoped that these images would give at least some idea of where the boy might have gone. the cameras captured the moments when James was walking next to his mother. One of the recordings shows how they stopped at the window, and Denise was making a purchase at the store. However, then everyone held their breath. On the cameras, two teenagers can be seen approaching James. One of them leans towards him, as if to say something, and then the boy is taken by the hand and led towards the exit of the shopping center. Neither the guards nor the other visitors seemed to pay any attention to this. Ralph Bulger, upon learning about the incident, immediately came to the mall to support his wife. Together, they hoped for a miracle that their son would be found and returned home. Meanwhile, the police focused on identifying the teenagers captured in the video. Their behavior raised questions. What were they doing at the mall? What was their purpose? Were they involved in James's disappearance? The inconsolable parents, staying in place, tried to gather all their strength. The police tried to calm them down, assuring them that they would do their best. By this time, the center had already been cordoned off. Guards and officers were combing the shops, corridors, parking lot, trying to find any traces of the child. Another part of the officers went on a tour of the neighboring areas. They interviewed local residents, drivers, and passers-by, hoping that someone had seen James. However, every hour without a trace increased the alarm and forced the police to prepare for the worst-case scenario. During the search, police received several calls from local residents who claimed to have seen a boy matching James's description. One of the calls came from a woman who noticed two teenagers accompanying a small boy near the mall. She claimed that the boy looked scared and reported which way they were heading. The police immediately went in the indicated direction. They checked the nearby streets, courtyards, and parks, but the tracks of James and his supposed companions were cut off again. The disappearance of James Bulger has put Liverpool police in front of a complex and extremely emotional investigation. Despite intensive searches and the help of local residents, the investigation was moving slowly. Realizing that the case was becoming critical, the police decided to address the public through the media. Ads describing James began to be broadcast on local television and radio. A 2-year-old boy in blue pants and a brown jacket has disappeared. Parents were asked to stay alert. The people of Liverpool responded to the call. Volunteers began searching nearby neighborhoods, parks, and abandoned buildings. At the same time, journalists filled the mall and its surroundings, recording every moment of the search. James's photo quickly spread through all the news outlets, but it did not bring results.
The arrests of 10-year-olds John Venables and Robert Thompson.
CCTV footage has become the only significant piece of evidence for the investigation. They show how two men calmly led the boy by the hand through the main entrance. Their behavior did not attract the attention of others, which allowed them to leave the center unhindered. The police began to analyze their appearance and possible age in order to narrow down the circle of suspects. However, the boys' faces were illegible, and their height was distorted due to the camera angle. So initially there was a version that the age of the kidnappers was around 13 to 14 years old. Nevertheless, when these guidelines with the footage were made public, all Liverpool boys of a similar age who missed school that day immediately fell under suspicion. Surveys of residents and employees of the mall provided additional details. Some witnesses recalled two boys who behaved strangely. They did not buy anything in stores, but walked around the mall, looking for something, whispering and laughing. These descriptions matched the appearance of the teenagers in the video. The case began to develop when the press published improved footage from CCTV footage, in which the figures became more distinguishable, especially when they were facing the cameras. On February 17th, the police received an anonymous call from a friend of the Venables family. She pointed out that the younger Venables looked like one of the boys in the recording and that he had missed school on the day of the incident. Police have asked local schools to help verify the information and identify the teenagers. A lot of students and teachers were interviewed, which made it possible to narrow down the search. As a result of this analysis, the police were able to identify the suspects. They were two teenagers, John Venables and Robert Thompson, both 10 years old. The next morning, at about 7:30, the police visited the suspects' homes. When the boys saw the guards, they were confused and behaved in such a way that they involuntarily aroused additional suspicions. However, initially, investigators assumed that Thompson and Venables could have acted under someone else's leadership, playing only a limited role in what happened. At first glance, John and Robert turned out to be ordinary schoolchildren. None of their acquaintances could believe that these children could be involved in James's disappearance. However, the behavior of both after the boys' disappearance raised questions. The police noticed that John and Robert began to avoid communication and often got confused in their stories about where they were on the day James disappeared.
The arrests of 10-year-olds John Venables and Robert Thompson, who were both later charged with James Bulger's murder.
After the police identified the two suspects recorded on CCTV cameras, interrogations began. The situation was difficult. In front of the investigators were not adult criminals, but two 10-year-old boys. However, the evidence gathered, the contradictions in their stories and their behavior increasingly pointed to their involvement in the disappearance of James Bulger. The initial interrogations began in the presence of the boys' parents and lawyers. John Venables looked depressed. His voice was trembling and his hands were constantly nervously fiddling with the fabric of his clothes. Robert Thompson, on the other hand, tried to appear calm, but the police noticed that his answers sounded too rehearsed, as if he had thought out in advance what he would say. When they were asked the first question, both boys firmly stated that they had not been to the New Strand Mall on the day James disappeared. John Venables claimed to have spent the whole day at home playing with toys. When asked to give more details, he began to get confused, talking about his friends, then about being in the park. Robert Thompson held to a different version. He said he spent the day with his mother, helping her with the housework. But when he was shown CCTV footage of him and John leading James away by the hand, his confidence began to crumble. Robert stated that he did not know the boy in the video at all, and he was just walking with a friend. However, this version did not stand up to criticism. When investigators began asking clarifying questions about why they took the little boy by the hand and where they were going, John and Robert began to shift the blame on each other. John said it was Robert who suggested talking to James and taking him with him. He said it would be fun, John said, avoiding eye contact with the police. Robert, in turn, claimed that it was John who first spoke to James and insisted on taking him away from the mall. "I was just following him," he said. The contradictions in their stories became more and more obvious. The police began to notice that each boy tried to present himself as an innocent victim of the other's influence. But as the interrogations continued, their versions increasingly coincided in small details, which allowed the investigators to reconstruct the events of that day. The officers used a strategy of gentle pressure, not intimidating the children, but gradually leading them to the need to tell the truth. The decisive moment was the recognition of John Venables. After several hours of intense interrogation, he could not stand it and began to cry. "We didn't want this. It was an accident," he said, holding his head in his hands. The police asked him to tell them exactly what happened. John started by saying that he and Robert decided to go to the mall to spend time. There, they noticed James, who was standing alone near the window. According to John, Robert offered to approach the boy and take him with him. "He looks so small and defenseless," John said, as if trying to justify his actions. John said that they took James away from the mall to take a walk with him. But when they were on the street, the boy began to cry and asked to be taken to his mother. "I wanted to bring him back, but Robert said we couldn't do that. Otherwise, he would tell about us," John added. He also mentioned that Robert started behaving aggressively and ordered him to be silent. Robert Thompson, upon learning of John's confession, at first denied his involvement, but then began to testify, which coincided with John's version. He admitted that they had indeed taken James away, but claimed that they had no intention of harming him. "We just wanted him to come with us," Robert said, avoiding details. However, when he was asked questions about what happened later, He became nervous and confused in his answers. Investigators began to ask questions about why they headed towards the railway tracks. At first, the boys said they were just looking for a place to hide, but then John admitted that they were scared. He started crying and screaming, and we didn't know what to do, he said. According to John, Robert suggested leaving James near the tracks so that no one would find them. The most shocking moment was the admission that they had injured James before leaving him. John stated that it was Robert's initiative, who said that this way they would be able to silence the boy. Robert, in turn, claimed that it was John who started it first. Their mutual accusations painted a horrifying picture of what was happening, confirming that both boys were acting together in an attempt to hide their tracks. John and Robert's confessions became key evidence for the investigation. The police realized that these two children not only took James away from the mall, but also deliberately tried to get rid of him, fearing the consequences. The collected evidence, including recordings from cameras, footprints at the crime scene, and confessions of the suspects themselves, allowed us to reconstruct the full picture of the events of that day. When the investigators asked the boys about their motives, their answers sounded childishly naive, but at the same time cruel. Robert admitted that he felt angry and wanted to feel stronger. John, on the other hand, said they just wanted to have fun and didn't think it would go that far. These confessions have raised many questions about how 10-year-old children could commit such an act. After the confession of John Venables and Robert Thompson, the police had the opportunity to find the body of 2-year-old James Bulger. In their stories, the boys mentioned the railroad tracks where they had taken James that day. Both of them pointed exactly to the place where they left the boy. For the investigators, the case was coming to an end, although the prospect that their worst fears would be confirmed caused heavy feelings. The police immediately went to the specified location. The railway tracks, located on the outskirts of Liverpool, in an abandoned area rarely visited by locals. This place was secluded and isolated, away from residential buildings and the eyes of passers-by. Detectives and criminologists arrived at the scene along with a group of officers. They carefully inspected the area, following the boys' instructions.
His body was found 2 miles away on a freight railway line.
James's body was found near the tracks. Officers found that its location matched the descriptions given by the suspects. Criminologists immediately began collecting evidence to save it for trial. The sight of the boy's body shocked even experienced investigators who had been working at crime scenes for years. The silence that fell among the officers spoke for itself. It was a difficult and emotionally exhausting find. The news of the discovery of James's body was a blow to his parents, Denise and Ralph Burger. They hoped to the last that their son would be found alive. When detectives informed them that James's body had been found, the mother couldn't hold back her tears. She blamed herself for losing sight of her son for a few seconds, and now this loss seemed irreparable to her. Ralph, restraining his emotions, tried to comfort his wife, but he was in a state of shock. How could this happen? Why with us? These questions did not leave Denise's head. Her life changed forever the day she let go of her son's hand at the mall. She recalled every moment of that morning, hoping to find an answer to how this tragedy could have been prevented. When the body was returned to the family for burial, the city united to express its support. Neighbors, friends, and just caring residents of Liverpool came to support the Bulgers in their grief. Flowers, candles, and condolence notes filled the courtyard of their house, reminding them that the whole city is grieving with them. The discovery of James's body not only gave his parents the opportunity to say goodbye to him, but also provided the police with important evidence to complete the case. Investigators have collected materials that confirmed John and Robert's involvement in the crime. The footprints found at the scene and the evidence associated with the suspects helped to reconstruct the full picture of events. The boys' confessions, although full of contradictions, coincided with the physical evidence. Their stories of how they brought James onto the path and left him there were supported by shoe prints that matched their shoes and other evidence found at the scene. These details convinced the investigation that the boys were not only guilty, but also acted intentionally. After confessions and analysis of evidence, the police completed the investigation and referred the case to the court. The public demanded justice, and media attention to the case reached its peak. James Bulger's family, not hiding their grief, called for the perpetrators to be punished, despite their young age. The trial of John Venables and Robert Thompson has become one of the most discussed in the UK. Their age raised many questions about how children who had committed such a serious crime should be judged. However, the investigation was confident in its position, having presented to the court all the evidence of their guilt. The trial began in November 1993 at Preston Crown Court and became one of the most discussed cases in British history. Despite their young age, the boys appeared in court as adults. This caused considerable controversy in the community, but prosecutors insisted that the crime was so serious that it required consideration in a court of royal jurisdiction. The court session was held in a tense atmosphere. The hall was crowded with journalists, relatives of James Bulger, and ordinary citizens who wanted to personally see how justice was being done. To ensure safety, John and Robert were taken to the courtroom separately, guarded by police officers. Throughout the trial, the boys' faces were hidden from the public to protect their identities from the press and the anger of the crowd. James's family was sitting in the front rows, listening intently to everything that was going on. James's mother, Denise Bulger, sometimes closed her eyes so as not to hear the details related to her son's death, but she stayed in the hall to support his memory. The father, Ralph Burger, tried to remain calm, but his restrained anger was felt in his every glance at the defendants. The charge, presented by prosecutor Richard Henry, was based on CCTV footage, shoe prints at the crime scene, witness statements, and confessions from the defendants themselves. Henry noted that despite John and Robert's age, their actions were deliberate and violent. He stressed that the boys were aware of what they were doing and tried to hide the traces of their crime. Their confessions were also presented, where they talked in detail about their actions. These testimonies left little doubt about their guilt. John and Robert's defense was based on their age and psychological state. The lawyers argued that the boys could not fully understand the consequences of their actions. They insisted that Robert and John grew up in dysfunctional families, which affected their psyche. Prior to the trial, Thompson was interviewed by child psychiatrist Eileen Vizard, and Venables was examined by a forensic psychiatrist at the British Ministry of the Interior, Susan Bailey. When the experts were asked at the trial whether the defendants understood the difference between good and evil, Bailey stated that Venables was aware of this difference, while Vizard could not give a definite answer regarding Thompson. They noted that Robert grew up in conditions of violence and conflict, and John often felt abandoned and lonely. These factors, according to the defense, could have influenced their actions. However, the prosecution objected, arguing that no difficult life circumstances could justify murder. The court heard testimony from witnesses who saw John and Robert taking James away from the mall. Some of them tried to intervene, but the boys told some that it was their younger brother, and others that they were taking him to the police station because he was lost. Forensic experts also provided data on shoe tracks found at the crime scene that matched the suspect's shoes. In addition, medical reports on James's condition and an analysis of the psychological profile of the defendants were presented to the court. Experts stressed that John and Robert's actions were deliberate, that they were trying to hide their crime and avoid punishment. After a 3-week trial, the jury returned a verdict. John Venables and Robert Thompson were found guilty of murdering 2-year-old James Bulger. Judge Moraes severely criticized their actions, calling them a barbaric and heartless crime that caused deep trauma not only to James's family, but also to the entire society. The court sentenced John Venables and Robert Thompson to 8 years in specialized children's correctional institutions. However, given the severity of the crime and public pressure, a year later the minimum term of their imprisonment was increased to 10 years. This meant that they would remain in custody until at least the age of 18, after which their fate had to be reviewed. The judge also ruled that after their release, They would be under surveillance and would not be able to return to their former lives, maintaining anonymity for their own safety. Their new names had to be kept secret to avoid possible retaliation from the public. The verdict caused a storm of indignation in society. Many believed that the term was too short for such a cruel crime. "This is not justice," Liverpool residents said, demanding tougher punishment. The James Bulger case has become one of the most tragic and debated events in British history. It not only shocked society with its cruelty, but also caused serious discussions about education, the juvenile justice system, and moral responsibility. Although John Venables and Robert Thompson were punished, the question of whether it can be considered sufficient remains open. James's story is a reminder of the fragility of human life and the need to protect the most vulnerable members of society.